Before you keep watching, say your last name out loud. Just once, quietly, to yourself. Now hold on to it, because by the end of this video, you might find out that name is not just a name. It might be a genetic signal, passed down almost unchanged for nearly 1,000 years, connecting you to a warlord who ruled a kingdom of islands off the coast of Scotland. Stranger still, you might carry that signal even if your last name has nothing to do with Scotland at all. Keep your name in your head. We are coming back to it. In a small lab in England back in the early 2000s, a geneticist named Brian Sykes was testing blood samples from ordinary men across Scotland. He was not looking for anything dramatic. He was mapping the general genetic history of the British Isles, one sample at a time. But when he reached a cluster of samples from men with surnames tied to the west coast and the islands, something stood out. A large group of these men, despite living in different towns, different families, different lives, shared an unusually specific pattern on their Y chromosome. The piece of DNA passed almost perfectly from father to son, generation after generation, changing only slightly and only by accident over hundreds of years. This kind of shared pattern does not happen by chance. It happens when a large number of men are all descended from the same one man, sometimes less than 1,000 years back. To understand why, it helps to know a little about how the Y chromosome actually works. Every man carries one, passed to him directly from his father, who got it from his father before him, stretching back in an unbroken male line for as far as you care to trace it. Unlike most of our DNA, which gets shuffled and mixed between both parents in every generation, the Y chromosome mostly copies itself exactly, father to son, with only tiny, rare changes creeping in every so often, almost like a typo appearing once every few hundred years in an otherwise perfectly copied document. Scientists can read these small changes, called markers, and use them almost like a fingerprint. Men who share the same rare markers and the same rare combination are almost certainly descended from the same male ancestor, and by counting how many small differences have built up between two men's markers, geneticists can even estimate roughly how many generations back their shared ancestor lived. Sykes and his team began digging into who that one man might have been. The surnames lined up almost too perfectly: MacDonald, MacDougall, McAllister. These were not random names. They were the names of clans, all of whom, according to centuries of Scottish tradition, claimed descent from a single medieval warlord. His name was Somerled. Somerled lived in the 1200s in the rugged, windswept world of the Hebrides, the islands scattered along Scotland's western coast. He was not a king in the way we usually imagine one. He carved his own kingdom out of chaos, uniting the western islands under his rule at a time when Vikings still controlled much of the surrounding sea, and Gaelic lords fought constantly over scraps of land. Historical records describe him as part Gaelic and part Norse, a man who grew up between two cultures, the old Celtic world of Scotland and the raiding, seafaring world of the Vikings, who had settled the islands generations earlier. He built alliances through marriage, through warfare, and eventually through sheer persistence, slowly turning a patchwork of contested islands into a kingdom stable enough to pass on to his children. When he died in the year 1164, killed during a campaign near Renfrew on the Scottish mainland, his sons split his territory between them, and over the following centuries, their descendants grew into some of the most powerful clans in Scottish history. What Sykes found, sitting quietly in ordinary blood samples nearly 900 years later, was the genetic echo of that split. A shared Y chromosome marker carried down through father after father, all tracing back to roughly the same time and the same region where Somerled had lived and ruled. Later estimates suggested that hundreds of thousands of men alive today, scattered across Scotland and far beyond it, likely carry the same genetic signature. Most of them will never know it. Most of them are simply living their lives, completely unaware that their own body carries a 1,000-year-old fingerprint left behind by a Hebridean warlord. This is where the deeper story begins, because Somerled's genetic legacy is not some strange, isolated case. It is a perfect example of something much bigger, something built into the very structure of how Scottish clans worked. To understand it, we need to understand what a clan actually was, and why, without anyone realizing it at the time, the clan system became one of the most accidentally effective genetic tracking systems in human history. A Scottish clan was, at its core, an extended family. The word itself comes from the Gaelic word for children, clan. In the earliest clans, this was almost literally true. A single powerful man would father many children, and those children would father their own children, spreading outward across generations, all while staying loyal to the same chief, the same territory, and eventually the same surname. Sons inherited their father's name. Those sons had sons, who inherited the same name again. Daughters, in most cases, took their husband's name when they married, meaning the clan surname followed almost exactly the same path as the Y chromosome itself, father to son, century after century. This is the spine of the entire story we are telling today. A surname, at least on the male side of a family, is really just a cultural copy of something biology was already doing quietly in the background. When a Scottish clan surname passed from a father to his sons, the Y chromosome usually passed along with it, almost perfectly matched generation after generation. This means that, in theory, if you could test the Y chromosome of every man alive today with a certain clan surname and trace it backward far enough, many of them should share a genetic signal reaching back to the same founding ancestor the clan claims in its own oral history. Somerled's case simply proved, for the first time with hard genetic evidence, that this idea was not just clan legend. It was, at least in some cases, biological fact. It is worth pausing here to notice what this system leaves out, because it is just as important as what it captures. The clan surname system only ever tracked one single line, the direct father-to-son line, ignoring every mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother along the way, even though each of them contributed just as much to a person's ancestry as any father did. A woman marrying into Clan MacDonald brought her own deep, rich genetic history with her, a history that mixed permanently into the clan's bloodline, yet her own maternal line, traced through mitochondrial DNA passed only from mother to child, was never reflected in the surname at all. This means every clan surname list, including the one in this video's title, is really only telling half the story, following a single, narrow thread of male ancestry while leaving an equally important, equally ancient female thread completely invisible in the historical record. Modern genetic testing can recover that missing half too, but it takes a different kind of test, looking at mitochondrial DNA instead of the Y chromosome, a reminder that any single family tree is really woven from thousands of ancestors, not just the handful whose names happen to survive on paper. Of course, real history is rarely this tidy, and the Somerled story only works as cleanly as it does because his descendants happen to be unusually well documented, unusually powerful, and unusually good at having sons who survive to have sons of their own. Most clan lineages do not stay this clean. Wars killed off entire branches of a family. Some men had no sons at all, ending a particular genetic line even while the clan name lived on through more distant cousins. And every so often a child was born whose biological father was not the man whose name he carried, quietly introducing a new, unrelated genetic line into a family that still, on paper, looked unbroken. This last point matters more than people usually realize, because it explains something that puzzled genealogists for years. When large modern DNA studies began testing men who all shared the same Scottish clan surname, they almost never found that all of them carried a single matching genetic signature. Instead, they usually found several different genetic clusters, all hiding under the same surname. One large cluster often does trace back to a shared ancestor, sometimes even matching the clan's traditional founding story, much like the Somerled cluster among MacDonalds. But smaller clusters, sitting right alongside it, tell a different story entirely, of families who joined the clan later, of name changes, adoptions, and quiet breaks in the paper trail that only DNA testing could ever reveal. Clan Fraser tells a quieter version of this same story, without the drama of an outlawed name, but with a twist of its own. Historians have long debated the Frasers' true origins, with some old traditions claiming a Norman-French ancestry brought to Scotland after the 1100s, while other local traditions insisted on a much older, purely Highland origin. Genetic testing of men carrying the Fraser surname has found something in between, a mix of different Y chromosome clusters, rather than one single unified signal. This tells geneticists that the Fraser name, unlike the tighter Somerled cluster among the MacDonalds, was likely adopted by several unrelated families over time, perhaps through marriage alliances, sworn loyalty to a powerful chief, or simple imitation of a respected and protected name. A clan, in other words, was not always one bloodline pretending to be a family. Sometimes it was several real, unrelated families choosing, quite deliberately, to become one. One clan tells this story of hidden identity more dramatically than any other. Clan Gregor, better known simply as the MacGregors, had a reputation as one of the fiercest and most independent clans in the Scottish Highlands. For generations, they clashed violently with their powerful neighbours, especially the much larger and more politically connected Clan Campbell. In the early 1600s, after a particularly brutal conflict, the Scottish Crown took an extraordinary step. It banned the name MacGregor entirely. Men were forbidden by law from using their own surname. Anyone caught using it could be punished severely, and in some periods, simply carrying the name MacGregor without royal permission was treated as a crime on its own. Faced with this, MacGregor families across the Highlands had to make an impossible choice. Some clung to their name anyway, at enormous personal risk. Many others quietly adopted new surnames, taking on the names of allied clans or names their families happened to already be connected to through marriage. Overnight, in official records at least, entire branches of the MacGregor bloodline seemed to vanish, replaced by names like Campbell, Murray, and Grant, names that, on paper, told a completely different story than the blood underneath them. This means that today, right now, There are almost certainly men walking around with Campbell, Murray, or Grant on their birth certificate, whose actual Y chromosome tells a McGregor story instead, a genetic memory of an outlawed name their ancestors were forced to abandon centuries ago just to survive. Their surname says one thing, their DNA, quietly, stubbornly, says another. When the ban on the McGregor name was finally lifted generations later, some of these families changed their name back, publicly reclaiming an identity their ancestors had been forced to hide. Others never did, and their descendants alive today may have no idea their family was ever anything other than Campbell, or Murray, or Grant. This is exactly why a list of clan surnames, even a very good one, can never tell the whole story on its own. Names carry history, but they do not always carry unbroken biology, and biology does not always follow the name written down on paper. The two usually travel together, but every so often, especially in a history as violent and complicated as Scotland's, they quietly split apart, leaving a mismatch that only a genetic test, run centuries later, can ever fully untangle. The MacLeod clan adds yet another layer to this genetic puzzle, and it takes us back to the same Norse influence that shaped Somerled's own bloodline centuries earlier. The MacLeods trace their traditional origins to the Isle of Skye and the Outer Hebrides, regions that had been heavily settled by Norse Vikings for generations before the clan system as we know it fully took shape. Modern genetic studies of men carrying the MacLeod surname have found a distinct genetic signature linked to Scandinavian ancestry, stronger among MacLeods than in almost any other Highland clan tested. This lines up closely with the clan's own oral traditions, which describe their founding ancestor as a man with strong ties to Norse settlers on the islands. Once again, centuries-old clan legend and modern genetic evidence turn out to line up with striking precision, giving weight to stories that outsiders might otherwise have dismissed as folklore. Clan Campbell offers a useful contrast to almost everything we have covered so far, because the Campbells did not rise to power through a single legendary founder in the same dramatic way Clan Donald did. Instead, the Campbells expanded steadily over centuries through careful political marriages, loyal service to the Scottish crown, and the patient absorption of smaller, weaker families into their growing territory. Genetic studies of men carrying the Campbell name reflect this different history clearly. Rather than one dominant cluster tracing back to a single medieval ancestor, researchers find a wider spread of different Y chromosome lineages, consistent with a clan that grew not by everyone sharing one bloodline, but by many separate families gradually adopting the same name, the same loyalty, and the same protection. Where the MacDonalds are a story of one bloodline spreading outward, the Campbells are a story of many bloodlines merging inward, and both patterns are still visible today, written quietly into the DNA of men who have never met, yet share the exact same surname passed down from entirely different medieval families. Now, let's go back to that name you said out loud at the beginning of this video, and let's follow it through the story of one more person, someone we will call Angus. Daigus grew up far from Scotland, in a suburb outside Toronto, in a family that had lived in Canada for 4 generations. His last name was a common Highland surname, one that showed up on almost every Scottish clan list he had ever seen at Highland festivals and tourist shops. But growing up, it never meant much to him beyond that. His grandparents told stories about a great-great-grandfather who had come over from Scotland sometime in the 1800s, but the details were hazy, the kind of half-remembered family history that gets passed down at holiday dinners and slowly worn smooth over generations. Angus assumed, like most people with a common clan surname, that it was probably just a name, nothing more. Curious and a little bored one weekend, Angus sent off a DNA test kit, mostly expecting a simple breakdown of percentages. A pie chart telling him he was some mix of Scottish, Irish, and English, the kind of result millions of people have already received and mostly forgotten about. What came back instead surprised him. Buried in the results was a note about his Y chromosome, flagging a genetic marker connected to a specific historical cluster tied to the west coast of Scotland, a marker researchers had linked in some carriers to the broader Somerled lineage that had first surprised Brian Sykes and his team years earlier. Angus was not a MacDonald. His surname belonged to a different, smaller clan, one historically allied with the larger Donald Confederation for generations, fighting alongside them, marrying into their families, sharing land and loyalty across the Western Highlands for hundreds of years. Somewhere in that long, tangled history, it seemed, one of his direct paternal ancestors had carried Somerled's own bloodline into a smaller, allied family line, one that eventually crossed an ocean and settled quietly outside a city Somerled himself could never have imagined. For Angus, that single genetic marker did something no family story ever had. It made the past feel real, physical, undeniable, sitting quietly inside his own cells this entire time. He had spent his whole life assuming his last name was just a label, something for filling out forms and introducing himself at work. Now he understood it was something closer to an inheritance, a thread stretching back across nearly 9 centuries, through wars, migrations, an ocean crossing, and 4 generations of Canadian winters, all the way back to a Hebridean warlord splitting his kingdom among his sons. He called his father that same night, half expecting him to already know, but his father was just as surprised as he was. Together, they pulled out an old family Bible, the kind many immigrant families kept as their only written record for generations, and found a name and a date scratched into the front page. A great-great-grandfather who had left Scotland sometime in the early 1800s. Until that phone call, the name had just been ink on old paper. Now it felt like the first visible link in a chain that reached back far further than either of them had ever imagined. A chain that had been sitting quietly inside their own bodies the entire time, waiting for a simple test to finally make it visible. Angus's story is not unique. It is happening right now, quietly, in DNA testing labs around the world, to thousands of people who share his surname, or a MacLeod surname, or a Campbell surname that might secretly be hiding a McGregor bloodline underneath it. This is the real reason so many people today, scattered across Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, still feel a strange pull toward Highland, surnames their families left behind generations ago. It is not simple sentimentality. In a growing number of cases, it is measurable, biological continuity, hiding in plain sight inside an ordinary last name. That global scattering did not happen by accident either, and it connects directly back to the same clan structures we have been tracing this whole time. Beginning in the 1700s and stretching well into the 1800s, a long, painful period known as the Highland clearances forced tens of thousands of Highland families off land their clans had held for generations. Landowners, increasingly focused on profit from sheep farming rather than loyalty to their old clan tenants, evicted entire communities, sometimes burning homes to prevent families from returning. The cruelty of this period is hard to overstate. Families who had lived on the same small plots of land for generations, often believing their chief still owed them protection under the old clan system, were given days, sometimes only hours, to leave homes their ancestors had built. Some resisted and were forcibly removed. Others watched their villages burn behind them as they walked toward the coast, carrying whatever they could on their backs. Many of these displaced families had nowhere left to go but the emigrant ships crossing the Atlantic toward Canada and the United States, or sailing even farther toward Australia and New Zealand, packed into crowded, often dangerous vessels for a journey that could take months. They carried very little with them on those ships. Most left behind their land, their homes, and almost everything they owned. But they carried their names, and inside those names, quietly, unknowingly, they carried their DNA too. This is why a Y chromosome marker, first traced to a 12th century Hebridean warlord, can now be found not just in Scotland, but scattered across small towns in Nova Scotia, farming communities in the American Midwest, sheep stations in rural Australia, and suburbs outside cities like Toronto, where a man named Angus grew up without ever knowing what his own last name was quietly carrying. Today, clan societies and genetic researchers around the world are working together in ways that would have seemed impossible only a generation ago, building large DNA databases specifically organized around clan surnames. Thousands of men with names like MacDonald, MacLeod, Campbell, Fraser, Gordon, Stewart, Bruce, Wallace, Robertson, Cameron, Grant, Monroe, Sinclair, Douglas, Kennedy, Murray, Ross, and Mackenzie have voluntarily submitted their Y chromosome results to these projects, hoping to find out exactly what Angus found out almost by accident. Slowly, cluster by cluster, these projects are mapping out which clan traditions hold up under genetic scrutiny, which surnames hide unexpected mixed origins, and which families, like the McGregors, quietly split apart under historical pressure, only to leave a trail that modern science can now follow back together. None of this means a simple list of clan surnames can tell you your exact ancestry with total certainty. Names shift. Adoptions happen. Unknown fathers appear quietly in family trees, generation after generation, without ever showing up in any written record. Commercial DNA tests, useful as they are, also work with limited historical databases, and a genetic match to a clan cluster is always a strong clue rather than absolute proof, especially for smaller or less studied surnames where scientists simply have not tested enough people yet to be fully certain. Genealogists and geneticists both agree that DNA works best alongside written records, old parish registers, and family memory, not as a replacement for them. But when a name and a genetic marker do line up, as they so often have for descendants of Somerled, the result is something remarkable, a piece of medieval history confirmed not by an old parchment or castle ruin, but by the quiet, patient evidence sitting inside living human cells, carried unknowingly for nearly 900 years. So think back to that name you said out loud at the very beginning. Maybe it is MacDonald or MacLeod or Campbell. Maybe it is a smaller, less famous Highland name, one that never made it onto the souvenir mugs and tea towels sold in Edinburgh gift shops, but still carried its own quiet, unbroken thread through history all the same. Maybe your family history has nothing to do with Scotland at all, and you are simply curious what your own hidden genetic story might reveal, waiting quietly inside your own cells the same way Angus's was, the same way hundreds of thousands of others are right now without knowing it. Somewhere out there tonight, someone else is about to say their own last name out loud for the very first time with new eyes, wondering, for the first time in their life, whether their ordinary, everyday name is actually something much older, much stranger, and much more personal than they ever imagined. A name is never just a name. Sometimes it is the last surviving thread connecting an ordinary life today to a kingdom of islands, a Hebridean warlord, and nearly 900 years of history, quietly written into the blood, waiting for someone, someday, to finally read it. And maybe that someone is you? Maybe tonight, after this video ends, you find yourself opening a search bar, typing in your own last name, wondering quietly whether it belongs to a MacDonald cluster, a Campbell patchwork, a hidden MacGregor line, or a Norse-Scandinavian thread stretching back to the Hebrides. You might find nothing at all, and that is its own kind of answer too. But you might find a small, strange thrill instead, the same thrill Angus felt reading his own results for the first time, the sudden quiet realization that the story you thought you knew about your own family was never quite complete, and that somewhere inside you, written in a language no one could read until very recently, an ancient island kingdom has been waiting patiently this entire time simply to be noticed.